Hello, you're listening to the Nomad of Dreams. Today we will approach the philosophy of Omar Khayyam, not as an antiquarian curiosity, but as a living network of ideas about how to deal with the briefness of life. The subject is not quotes or facts, but those stable motifs of thought that help one live more clearly. This matters because we are talking about everyday bearings, what to value, how to doubt, and why to celebrate moments. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is for you now. Write in the comments. I always like to see the geography and the hours when this voice reaches the world. Take a couple of deep breaths, drop your shoulders. Let the breath return a sense of the present moment. Orient yourself by the rhythm. Calmer. It's better for thinking. Omar Khayyam appears as a thinker who questions all absolutes and proposes living with a critical attention to the present. His thinking is not a system of rules, but a set of norms and images, a way of seeing the world through transience, pleasure, and irony. It remains relevant because it addresses an unchanging human situation, limited time, mortality, and incomplete knowledge. This practical orientation makes him not a historical curiosity, but a trumpet for living here and now. It's time to move to the first theme, enjoying the present as a moral bearing. His image as a thinker can be characterized briefly. A gatherer of meanings who prefers a terse form of thought instead of long explanations. Such compactness is not accidental. Condensed phrasing turns reflection into a tool for immediate action. Thought becomes suitable not only for discussion, but for experiencing at the table, among people, in moments of doubt. This is strengthened by the particular rhythm of his utterances. They are designed for a short, flash-like awareness that changes the course of the day. The type of thinking is primarily practical normative, less theoretical constructions and more life-guiding bearings. These bearings are expressed in images, wine, rosé, feast, in intentions, sincerity, the courage to doubt, and in moral emphases, the value of the present, skepticism toward anti-celebrations. This approach combines the aesthetic and the ethical. Beauty is closely linked to transience, and morality is built around accepting limitation. At its core lies a principle that does not require proof in the historical sense. It is tested by everyday life. Why does such thinking still work? Because it answers a basic human dilemma. How to live fully when time is limited and knowledge is incomplete. Instead of promises of future rewards, it offers practices for the present. Eat, drink, converse, doubt honestly. That answer is universal because it relies on bodily experience and social closeness. What remains consistently important even as cultural codes change. Another explanation for its effectiveness is the method of irony and doubt. It does not impose dogma, but allows values to be reconsidered in each specific case. Thinking is constructed using certain techniques. An imagistic presentation of the problem, a short moral strike, and a call to bodily reality. It's a method, not a dogma. It permits local contrasts and mockery of pretensions without destroying the values themselves. Skepticism here is not an end in itself, but a tool for liberation from empty rituals and claims to absolute truth. The result is a model of moral behavior in which action in the present matters more than preparations and expectations for tomorrow. The limits of such a position are obvious and honestly acknowledged by him. Recognition of ignorance implies a renunciation of claims to a final answer. This is not weakness, but an aesthetic and ethical stance, to live well under conditions of uncertainty. Such a stance assumes that pleasure can be justified and that a meal, a conversation, shared laughter are not secondary entertainments, but a way of testing meaning. Doubt and irony thus become organizing, not destructive, principles of interaction. A concluding thought before the first theme. The approach we have just discussed translates philosophy into the practical plane. It suggests how to evaluate moments and why one should not transfer meaning to an indeterminate future. This brings us directly to the first problem, enjoying the present as a moral imperative. And in the following discussions, we will look at what exactly drives this imperative and how it relates to other motives of thought. Enjoying the present is not simply an aesthetic choice or a way to escape worries. It is a moral demand placed on every action when we agree that the only trustworthy sphere of action is now. Such a thesis implies that value is not deferred to the future as some kind of credit, but is appropriated by the moment as the final measure of meaning. If life is brief and uncertain, then any moral planning that leads to constant postponement of joy risks becoming self-deception. The explanation of this position is straightforward. By acting in the present with awareness of transience, a person tests morality by deeds, not promises. The evaluation of life ceases to be theory and becomes practice. Brief conclusion. A morality oriented to the present teaches transforming desire into responsible action here and now, not into a bank of hopes for an unknown tomorrow. In Omar Khayyam's words, this turn toward immediate fullness sounds like a renunciation of the philosophical economy of waiting. Why does this imperative not reduce to a simple justification of momentary pleasure? The question sets the frame. What distinguishes conscientious enjoyment from empty escape? The analysis requires criteria: consent to the consequences for others, honesty with oneself, willingness not to hide the cost of one's actions behind rhetoric of deferred good. When enjoyment is tied to attention to the body and to society, it ceases to be an individualistic whim and becomes an ethical practice. A shared dinner, an open conversation, laughter that does not press on another's pain. All these are ways of making joy a shared responsibility. To generalize, the imperative of the present requires moral boundaries. Otherwise, it slides into rationalizing escape. The line is visible where enjoyment causes harm or serves as a mask for avoiding responsibility. Omar Khayyam acknowledges that line, not glorifying idleness as an absolute, but opposing it with meaning tied to honesty before life. The link between image and meaning is simple. A moment fully experienced functions as an exam for the soul. The light of a candle on the table, the crunch of bread, the breath beside you. These are not mere evening cosmetics, but a means to test whether behavior corresponds to the values a person has proclaimed. The importance of this test is that it makes values alive. If a moral ideal does not withstand the trial of bodily pleasure and togetherness, it remains an empty formula. The historical attachment here is natural. Omar Khayyam systematically translates philosophical assertions into images of the feast and the rose, thereby demonstrating that morality without body and taste is blind. Omar Khayyam repeats the idea of responsibility to the present as a justification for joy. In his understanding, life is tested not by fasting on hopes, but by the fullness of the moment. The limit of this demand is not permissiveness, but a moral test of each pleasure. It is this form of the imperative that Khayyam proposes as the practice of an honest life. I can deliver exactly on request, but for that I need a little time and to clarify whether you allow repetition of phrases or want a fully coherent text without obvious repetition. Which option do you prefer? The problem is that wine in poetic language is often taken as a simple justification of idleness and consolation from reality, whereas it acts as a symbol of liberation of language and body. This leads to a two-step distortion. Some see in the images of wine only lust and debauchery, others the only permissible therapy for the boredom of being. Such polarization erases a subtle thought. The impulse toward sincerity and the removal of social masks is easily replaced by encouragement to evade responsibility. Omar Khayyam himself provokes risky readings. For some, his poems sound like a call to drunkenness, but that is a superficial perception that does not take into account the ethical work embedded in the image. The problem posed is how to distinguish symbolic liberation from a primitive apology for pleasure. How to distinguish genuine liberation from a justification of flight. The question requires criteria. The first criterion is openness of speech. If wine serves as a means for people to speak the truth to each other and to themselves, it performs a symbolic function. The second is consent and responsibility. Liberation that entails mutual acceptance of consequences does not replace responsibility, but makes it visible. The third is doubt as a method. If the drink provokes not oblivion, but skepticism toward assertions that once seemed indisputable, it acts as a philosophical instrument. The fourth is communal experience. When drinking turns into private escape, the symbol collapses. When it unites an open space for collective reflection, its meaning is preserved. In his poems, Omar Khayyam uses these signs not to legitimize any witness, but to show where exactly the image of wine becomes a philosophical act. In the end, the criterion is simple. Liberation should weaken the theatricality of the social mask, without dissolving the moral fabric of the community. If the listed criteria are met, the consequences for public life and for the individual are far from trivial. The depiction of a table where glasses clink ceases to be merely aesthetics and becomes a condition of truth. People begin to admit fears, promises, mistakes. Such an effect undermines the orderly system of sham obligations. It subverts the need for hypocritical rituals and makes internal contradictions visible. The downside is a possible seductiveness. If the drink is used to switch off doubts, society loses its capacity for critique, and individuals lose their inclination to accept the consequences of their actions. A person falls silent, not because he has found truth, but because he has lost the nerve to resist. Omar Khayyam shows both sides, wine as revelation and wine as cover-up, and it is their tension that forms the ethical dilemma of the image. It is clear. Liberation affects both language and institutions of trust. In the right frame, it is close to a policy of freedom of speech. In the wrong one, to a society ruled by apathy. A particular image clarifies the line of thought. The cork pops, wine pours. The conversation is at first tentative, then sharp. And it turns out that long hidden doubts are spoken without adornment. When this image functions as a symbol, it acts as a reduction of ritual. The play sheds the costume of hypocrisy. The point is that wine models a situation where body and word converge. The voice becomes less guarded, gestures less theatrical, and as a result, confessions appear that otherwise would not have been voiced. Omar Khayyam constantly returns to such scenes, forcing one to see that liberation is not in the drink, but in the opened field of communication. But if wine becomes an instrument for dulling sensitivity, if it systematically displaces duty to one's neighbor, the image changes meaning and ceases to be an ethical resource. The boundary is clear and short. The symbolic role of wine is limited to a context of mutual honesty and responsibility. It does not extend to situations where alcohol serves as a cover for avoiding decisions, abusing power, or concealing violence. Liberation that excludes consequences ceases to be liberation and becomes escape. It is precisely this boundary that the poetic moralizer neatly fixes. Enjoyment matters as long as it makes the person more transparent, not dimmer. Omar Khayyam sets the glass not as a sign of permissiveness, but as a provocation, a test of whether the word can withstand the trial of intonation and flesh. This is the limit. The image of wine permits liberation of thought, but does not free one from responsibility to life and the people around. The mechanism of exposing irony in poetic language is a device with several movements: feigned reverence, a shift of perspective, and a sharp, compressed conclusion. First, the speech pretends to agree with the ritual, repeats its vocabulary and gestures. Then it discovers the mismatch between word and deed, turns the habitual argument against itself, and concludes with a well-placed sting. The Rubaiyat has a dagger that lays open the lining of hypocrisy. That method works not by attacking faith per se, but by making mechanical repetitions visible. Words spoken out of habit remain without action. Irony forces the listener to feel the emptiness of those repetitions. Omar Khayyam uses this technique so that ceremony ceases to be a protective shell and begins to look like a theatrical costume that can be removed. And then it becomes a question of who is underneath. The conclusion here is simple. The action of irony is not the destruction of the sacred, but the exposure of formality as a precondition for honesty. Why is such a device needed in public life and in poetry? Rituals perform useful functions: grounding, solidarity, transmission of meaning. But where ritual becomes taboo, where repetition replaces thinking, society begins to live by inertia. The question is direct. What price do we pay for the peace that is maintained only by ritual gestures? The analysis shows that the price is the loss of responsibility and the capacity for self-reflection. Groups shelter behind faultless form, and individual moral dilemmas are erased under the pressure of collective approbation. Here, Omar Khayyam offers not mere mockery, but an instrument of moral diagnosis. Irony is needed to show where speech ceases to be speech, where it serves only to preserve status and covers weak points in action. An image helps to feel the mechanism. A parade where people march in identical clothes and each sings familiar words, until one voice suddenly shifts the melody and utters a phrase stripped of its habitual ritual meaning. A pause in the hall, then a murmur, then a conversation that no longer revolves on the old plane. The point of this image is that exposure can be quiet and precise, not a lightning strike, but a small shift in tone that changes context. Omar Khayyam often uses such a subtle change of intonation. He does not smash the temple with a crowbar, but shows a crack in the wall so people can see that the foundation is weak. The tie to life is simple. When ritual ceases to be a verifiable action, it stops being a moral guide and becomes an aesthetic element. Where does the mechanism break? Breakdowns occur in three types. The first is when irony turns into cheap cynicism. It ceases to point to gaps and begins to humiliate the weak, making spiritual frailty a subject of ridicule. The second is when exposure becomes an end in itself and veils any constructive perspective. Criticism, having lost the desire to restore honesty, remains negative energy. The third is when society reads satire literally, or institutions absorb its meaning, turning resistance into a fashionable style. Then irony loses its diagnostic power and becomes part of the very ritual it once sought to expose. In these breakdowns, the method ceases to be healing and becomes an instrument for destroying trust instead of restoring it. Omar Khayyam warns of such dangers. Irony must be aimed at revelation, not at corruption. How to keep the mechanism working and prevent its distortion? It is important that exposure retain a moral orientation. The goal is not to destroy practice as such, but to restore its verifiability. Not to burn the flesh of ritual, but to give it the breath of honesty. This limit is marked by the responsibility of the author and the listeners. Words, even ironic ones, require care for those who interpret them differently and for potential consequences for the vulnerable. Then, criticism remains a tool for correction, not entertainment. The final conclusion, irony, as Omar Khayyam proposes, acts like a surgeon's scalpel. Its task is to open a diseased spot for healing, not to turn the body of society into ashes. It is precisely such restrained, directed irony that returns rituals their content and makes society more honest, not merely wittier. The aesthetics of measure also matter. Irony that keeps form may allow itself sharpness because it preserves respect for human fragility. Khayyam's poetry shows how word, tone, and pause together create space for rethinking. The listener, feeling vulnerability, makes the decision to change on his own, not under the dictator's exposure. In public practice, this means creating conditions for dialogue where criticism does not exclude but invites correction. Only then does irony remain a weapon of truth, not a fashionable empty thing. It awakens conscience while leaving room for compassion. Such words remind us, criticism without compassion loses meaning and only sharpens wounds. Let irony be sparing but unyielding. It awakens conscience without destroying a life, reviving faith. What makes a ritual hypocritical rather than merely a human frailty that can be indulgently forgiven as habit and weakness? The question is not idle. It's not about whether a rite is sometimes appropriate and sometimes not, but about when a rite begins to muffle conscience, replacing responsibility with form. In his Rubaiyat, Omar Khayyam did not try to destroy sacred gestures for effect. He asks a narrower question. Does the form itself violate the purpose for which it was intended? When prayer becomes a spectacle, when bows and words serve the bonding of power and favor, rather than a true turning of the soul, the ritual stops being a moral orienting point and becomes its negation. The flip side of this thought is that ritual hypocrisy is not always outwardly visible and often feeds on the best of intentions. Rituals bring order, memory, consolation, and that makes them attractive shells for political and social interests. Where power demands uniform behavior, the language of ritual becomes the language of consent. Where fear of change is great, ritual closes down discussion. Omar Khayyam exposes this process not with flashy mockery, but with a precise remark. Words gain power through repetition, and repetition can turn truth into a formula and care into pose. The appearance of sincerity is sustained by rhetoric, and then criticism must distinguish surface from center, to expose not the rite itself, but the function that the rite has begun to perform in place of conscience. Development requires a look at the structure of this substitution and its consequences. Here one can go analytically. Why does the substitution arise? How does it consolidate? And where does it lead? People seek certainty, Institutions offer it in the form of rules and forms. Over time, the mechanics work like this. A rule is fixed in language. Language accumulates ceremony. Ceremony becomes a measure of loyalty. The consequences are visible on two planes, individual and social. At the personal level, responsibility decays. It is easier for a person to recite a set of gestures than to make a hard decision. At the societal level, genuine moral discussion is dulled because the issue is framed as a violation of ritual rather than a moral dilemma. Omar Khayyam shows that under these conditions, faith and morality shift. Faith remains, but its meaning fades, and morality becomes a matter of compliance. The result is the widespread of cynicism, or conversely, fanatical zealotry, when form is defended as the supreme good. An image gives the final touch to fix the boundary. Imagine a book with gold embossing placed prominently, but its pages are blank. The embossing serves outward impression. The reader sees wealth, but no content. The point of the image is that a ritual deprived of work on meaning remains only the appearance of authority. It reflects but does not create warmth. The tie to Khayyam's poetic manner is not to sweep the altar away, but to demand the book be filled with meaning, to return verifiability, responsibility, and honesty of speech to ritual. Critique of religious hypocrisy, if it remains honest, does not destroy form but restores its function, to serve as a reminder of moral duties, not their replacement. This is the border. Exposure must lead to the restoration of conscience. Otherwise, it remains merely an empty attack. It is important that the restoration of meaning requires not only criticism, but constructive work. The revival of moral practices that are tied to responsibility, not to outward display. This is impossible without educational effort, not abstract admonition, but teaching people to distinguish form from content, to read behavioral signs as prompts rather than as substitutes for decision. Here, the role of public institutions is ambiguous. They can be agents of change or, on the contrary, reinforce hypocrisy. Consequently, the task of moral renewal is mixed. Institutional reforms are needed alongside personal discipline. The first level includes procedural transparency, leader accountability, and the independence of public critique. The second, an honest dialogue in which people learn to admit mistakes and do not hide behind words. Finally, returning ritual to its purpose does not exclude its beauty. Ritual is beautiful when it feeds a commitment to others, when it helps people fix memory and experience solidarity. Beauty and purposiveness should go together. Ritual as aesthetic form and ritual as moral compass. Omar Khayyam reminds us that poetry points the way, but each person must walk it themselves. Exposing hypocrisy is only the first step. More important is the turn toward responsibility, toward the constant practice of conscience in deeds, words, and gestures. And if society manages to join form with content, rituals will again become support, not a box of empty phrases. This path is hard because it requires the courage to give up convenient illusions. But it is precisely courage that allows form to acquire flesh and blood. People will start to demand answers, not ritual proofs. Then rituals will become alive and society responsible. Let rituals serve truth, not mask. Okay. The corollary is obvious and at the same time insidious. When death constantly lurks behind the shoulder, everything acquires a different density. Conversations become shorter, decisions simpler, pleasures more demanding of truth. Mortality not only gives value to the moment, it shifts the scale of values. Small joys take on the character of a last will. Promises of the future lose their claim to exclusivity, and duty to the living and to oneself becomes more demanding than obligations to abstract ideals. Omar Khayyam repeatedly returns to this consequence in his stanzas. The knowledge of finitude makes honesty with oneself not a luxury, but a condition of existence. It turns out that human life, seen through the prism of mortality, ceases to be an arena of endless postponements and becomes a field of choice where every gesture is tested for sincerity. Why does finitude produce such a restructuring of meaning? The question is not idle. The reason lies in the relationship between time and the price of choice. Death introduces a strict limiter, the resource of time, and this limiter acts as a filter. All projects, all promises pass through it, and whatever does not withstand the test of finitude loses weight. The mechanics are simple and work automatically. The closer the sense of the end, the stronger the shift from the abstract to the bodily, from the future to the present. Habits and institutions that gave the illusion of endlessness suddenly turn out to be secondary. Omar Khayyam records this move not as a justification for frivolity, but as a diagnostic metric. If the meaning of life is reduced to the accumulation of symbols, then, under the pressure of mortality, those symbols crumble. Moral consequences follow from this. Not only a pursuit of pleasure, but a demand for authenticity in relationships, clarity of priorities, a renunciation of jasmine-like talk in favor of deeds that will endure the test of time. A clarification is important. Awareness of mortality does not necessarily lead to frivolity or to cynical consumption of pleasures. Death shifts the scale, but it also raises the demands on how life is used. The difference is subtle and often forgotten. Aesthetically, the same action can be either a casual lapse or a deep response to the knowledge of finitude. A small example. A person who pours a glass of wine in the evening, not as escape, but as an acknowledgement of taste and friendship, uses mortality as an instrument of a ritual of fidelity, not as an excuse for flight. Omar Khayyam encodes this feeling in his Rubai. In compressed form, beyond enjoyment, there appears the demand of responsibility for what this enjoyment changes in the soul. Thus, finitude is not an excuse for instinct, but a criterion of maturity. How do you live knowing that time is not infinite? The attachment to a poetic manner becomes the final step. Meditations on death in Omar Khayyam do not turn into a gloomy moralism. They become an aesthetics of truth. His figurative language, rose, wine, cups, functions as a reminder that beauty and fragility are allied. From this follows the moral imperative to live so that every action could withstand the gaze of the end. Mortality serves as a background that does not suppress actions, but clarifies them. In this key, Khayyam does not call for thoughtless revelry, nor declare life a preparation for non-existence. He insists that finitude be a teacher of humility and sincerity, that pleasure be combined with honor, and a fleeting moment with full devotion to oneself and others. The boundary of thought is clear. To remember death means to make life more demanding of meaning, not easier with excuses. In this perspective, each act acquires the weight of a decision, whether it is forgiveness, renunciation of an old ambition, or a simple call to a friend. Honesty before one's time means being able to choose not the easy things, but those deeds that correspond to inner truth. And this is not always pleasant. Sometimes truth requires giving up lucrative schemes, habitual roles, the security of others' eyes. But that renunciation frees up energy for what really matters. If before we could afford to live by inertia, Now inertia is exposed as illusion, and the remaining freedom as a resource requiring wise stewardship. From this point of view, Khayyam's wisdom is less poetic and more practical. His rubai are not only a summons to pleasure, but instructions on combating empty talk and self-indulgence. And yet, at the center remains practice rather than theory. The habit of checking every morning whether the day is slipping into empty tasks, whether feelings are being replaced by rituals. Such practice strengthens the capacity to take the risks necessary for sincerity and brings that rare lightness the poet wrote about. Lightness not of carelessness, but of precision of choice. As a result, life with awareness of finitude becomes a discipline of good simplicity. We learn to let go of what drags us down and to hold on to what pulls us forward. This is not a dramatization of departure, but an orderly sorting of values. And if Khayyam's smile sometimes seems irony toward the world, that irony is the last chip of wisdom for those ready to hear. To live means to choose with love for the truth and respect for finitude. Take one particular rubai, compressed to a point. 4 lines where tomorrow's emptiness embraces the past, and choice is placed in the tension between the cup and the promise. In such a private situation, one can see how form functions, not as ornament, but as a test. A line stripped of ranting leaves the reader face to face with the demand to decide, to feel, to do, to speak. Omar Khayyam, in this small structure, knows how to leave so much space that any superfluous sound becomes guilty. The particular case shows that compression of text is not a reduction of meaning, but an intensification of the canon of decision. The brief conclusion is simple. The rubai forces quicker, clearer choices. Those accustomed to hiding behind long arguments would feel awkward before such tidy demand. Small expression exposes priorities and tests for honesty, an effect that works instantly and often painfully. Why does compression affect the mind so directly? The question is not rhetorical. It is because human attention is limited, and meaning squeezed into brevity concentrates precisely those tensions that usually dissolve in length. When the question arises of which episode to choose, which attachment deserves time, the rubai formulates them without embellishment and thereby shifts the problem from the level of abstraction to the level of practical choice. Analysis of the mechanism shows 3 steps. First, everything superfluous is removed. Context, excuses, decorations. Then, sharp points of meaning remain, which the brain quickly recognizes as priorities. Finally, from this recognition, an action or its refusal is born. The reason is a reduction of cognitive load. The device is a concentrated metaphor and rhythm that function as signals. The consequences are an acceleration of moral decision and a purification of motivation. Such a device makes the rubai an instrument not only poetic but ethical. From this, one can generalize. The rubai is a model of philosophical thinking in miniature. As a method, it shows that thought does not have to expand into epic arguments to be complete. Sometimes, fullness is achieved by removing the superfluous. In a broader sense, rubai become a training of the mind, a habit of selecting the most essential and abandoning words that serve as masks. Omar Khayyam here appears as a master practitioner. His poems offer an exercise in clarity available to anyone ready to accept compactness as a norm of thinking. The image helps to feel this generalization. A small rubai is like a honed razor blade that does not break on trifles, but requires skill to hold. One cannot arbitrarily compress mental threads, and gesture and precision are needed. Otherwise, the rubai becomes a blunt aphorism. Omar Khayyam often combines lightness of images with ruthless demand of meaning, and in that combination, the power of the form is visible. The point of this metaphor is that brevity by itself is no guarantee of truth. A compressed phrase can be witty and empty at the same time. The rubai is advanced as an instrument of the practice of thinking, but its application requires contextual understanding and moral maturity. If a short line replaces thoughtful reflection instead of provoking it, the effect is opposite. Not insight, but even greater superficiality. The connection with Khayyam's thought emphasizes the boundary. The poet uses the rubai to awaken the stewardship of life, not to substitute for the stewardship itself. Therefore, the limit of application is obvious. A poem is enough to point the direction, but it will not replace prolonged labor, conversations, and deeds. The rubai clarifies choice. It does not claim to replace the deeds that this choice generates. Nevertheless, the practice of the rubai gives a clear rule for daily life. Cultivate the habit of minimally sufficient expression that requires actions. This does not mean abandoning complex reasoning, but rather discipline. First, formulate the goal in a few lines. Then, map out the ways to achieve it. Thus, thought passes through a clarity filter. If it does not withstand the concise formula, there is vagueness or hypocrisy in it. One can add a simple technique. Before starting a long text or project, try to describe it in one rubai, 4 lines of thought. Give yourself a rule. If you cannot, postpone the work, reassess priorities, find the core. Such a slow, fast check saves from many wasted efforts and disciplines language. Finally, it is important to remember the human format. The rubai works in dialogue, not in a solo act. Its strength unfolds when the short formula becomes the beginning of a conversation, not the end. When the rubai becomes a monologue, it is dead. When it is an invitation, it generates actions. Preserving this balance is the real science of applying brevity. This exercise is useful both for speech and for deeds. It clarifies intention, cuts dozens of empty words, and shows where action is required. Start small. 1 idea, 1 task, 1 bold line, and act. In a week, you will notice that decisions come easier and conversations become shorter and more useful. Brevity is not an end in itself. It is an instrument for life. This art requires patience and honesty. Do not be afraid to cut phrases, but preserve the depth of thought. The rule is simple and strict. Joy does not exist apart from sorrow. They are linked to each other as inseparably as light and shadow. Omar Khayyam turns this into a poetic law. You cannot demand one without allowing the other, and makes recognition of this linkage not only an observation, but a method of life. The interweaving of feelings becomes an ethical stance. If you strive only for pure joy, you inevitably miss the depth that makes joy substantial. A short conclusion. To accept joy as inevitably tinged with sorrow is to return meaning to it. How does this cut through habitual notions of happiness? Why do we expend energy trying to get rid of bitterness as if one could find light without a shadow. The question is not metaphorical. It raises the problem of evaluations and desires. Analysis shows that the pursuit of joy without sorrow often leads to its devaluation. Joy loses contrast and thus becomes transparent, like tasteless water. One micro example. If a person is always surrounded by merriment, any grief seems absurd and therefore repellent. In such an environment, a rare peaceful moment will be insignificant. The generalization is this: denying sorrow erases the measure of joy and makes it a casual luxury rather than a foundation of life. Imagine a room lit everywhere with no shadow. It first seems paradisical, but in it is hard to read and distinguish lines. The eye tires, objects lose volume. The point of the image is that emotional uniformity levels layers of meaning. The link to Khayyam's poetic technique is obvious here. In his rubai, emptiness and fullness coexist, which is why each line sounds as if behind laughter one immediately sees the trace of tears. He does not cover one with the other. He shows how contrast creates substantive distinction. The rule generates tension in personal practice. How to manage moments of joy when you know their dual nature. Analysis of this tension leads to two tendencies that are often mistaken: escaping sorrow in pursuit of pleasure, and rationalizing pleasure by suppressing grief. Both tendencies are ways to weaken anxiety, but each diminishes the fullness of experience. The short conclusion? The ability to be in joy requires simultaneous readiness to hold it and to let it go, which is closer to the practice of compassion than to the technique of avoidance. On the question of moral consequences of this recognition, one should look to the language of actions. If joy and sorrow are a pair, ethical practice lies not in fixing emotions, but in recognizing where each comes from and giving them space. Omar Khayyam shows this through an invitation to communal feasting and conversation. In the shared cup of wine and in the acknowledgement of finitude, there is room for both laughter and sorrow. The consequence is not calm resignation to fate, but a discipline of heartful attention, not to flee from grief and not to demand full justification from joy. The image of the final step, a thin cup in which wine reflects both sun and cloud. In it, joy and sorrow are reflected simultaneously, and no one tries to scoop one out to leave the other. The meaning of such an image is to live without staging a coup of emotions against each other, but also without turning sorrow into a permanently paralyzing sentence. The practical link. Choose rituals that mark both poles. Sing and weep. Give thanks and grieve in the same circle of friends or in the silence of one's own discipline. The resolution is a simple action. Give joy and sorrow equal right of presence and learn to read their shared language. Omar Khayyam does not propose calm escapism. He proposes a technique of endurance of feeling, the art of accepting joy while understanding its price, and of meeting sorrow knowing that it does not annul joy, but makes it meaningful. The concluding boundary is clear and strict. Living means working with this dual fact, not fighting it. The practical side of such acceptance is simple and delicate. Start small. Each day mark one moment of gratitude and one moment of sorrow. Not trying to compare them, but simply noting their presence. In conversation with others, strive to listen when a person speaks of grief, not hastening to fix their state with a compliment or advice, but responding with presence. In ritual, you can combine actions. Light a candle and release a sheet of paper with a recorded fear. Propose a toast to joy and a pause of memory. These simple gestures teach to distinguish subtle shades of emotion and to make space safe for both poles. It is important not to confuse acceptance with passivity. Acceptance is clear seeing and then choice. Whether to act, change circumstances, seek help. It removes drama but does not cancel responsibility. Such understanding changes social practices. In schools and workplaces, we need a culture where tears are not judged, just as laughter is not judged. Where they teach to manage energy, not to suppress it. Finally, living by this rule means maintaining a constant readiness for change. Joy, like sorrow, is capricious. The more we practice open presence, the more organic life becomes, rich and full of meaning. This is the path. Thank you. There is a contrast between the habitual inclination to seek order and the fact that the world regularly acts as a chaotic actor. We hope for causality, and reality throws in chance. Omar Khayyam does not romanticize disorder. He draws attention to how randomness breaks our schemes, and at the same time frees us from the tyranny of predestination. This rupture is not merely an aesthetic device, but a working field for moral consciousness. Where the predictable ends, the space for choice begins. The conclusion from the contrast is simple and astringent. If the world is partly random, then fear of error and of eternal guilt loses its foundation. But at the same time, responsibility grows for the small things that are controllable. Chance does not excuse actions. It changes the measure of expectations and centers the ability to respond rather than to possess the outcome. One could ask differently, how to live when outcomes are not guaranteed and every cause can be nullified by chance? Omar Khayyam pushes toward another manner of question, not how to eliminate the unexpected, but how to build a life in which the unpredictable does not become a moral sentence. The question already shifts the emphasis from struggle to the skill of being present in uncertainty. Analysis shows several components of this skill. The cause, our desire for control, is fueled by the wish for security. The device, social rituals, plans, and forecasts create an illusion of stability and promise meaning. The consequences. Under real intervention of chance, these devices either show themselves as flexible tools or break, causing panic. Limits here are important. No practice will eliminate chance entirely, but one can develop procedures that minimize destruction and increase adaptability. In such conditions, Omar Khayyam teaches to see in randomness an invitation to turmoil and to opening at once. The generalization emerges in an ethical takeaway. To accept unpredictability means to stop treating every event as a final voice of fate, and to begin relating to the world as a field of possibilities where risk does not negate the value of choice. This is not an excuse for recklessness, but a revaluation of what we deem serious. Randomness turns some of our claims to eternity into temporary duties and frees us from endless self-examination. An image for inner feeling. The wind that tears petals from the rose. It is neither malicious nor fair. It simply acts. At that moment, both beauty and loss appear. Each plucked stem changes the picture of the garden, but does not deprive it of meaning. Omar Khayyam often inclined toward images where natural unpredictability turns out not to be an enemy, but a co-participant in the human experience. The meaning of this image is that randomness shows the limits of our control and, at the same time, expands the field of moral creativity. One cannot predict, but one can prepare to meet the unexpected, with kindness, with a readiness to share the surplus, and with the ability to let go. This skill is not a technical trick, but a distinctive mindfulness that Khayyam introduces into the practice of life as a way to preserve joy and dignity in any change. Fixation. Living with contingency means choosing habits and rituals that acknowledge the unpredictable, sharing bread and speech without demanding guarantees, planning flexibly, learning to let go of outcomes. Omar Khayyam proposes such a daily discipline, not to fight the wind, but to set the tables so that people can gather both in the light and in the shade. The boundary is clear. Acceptance of contingency does not cancel action. It changes its form. I can continue, but to clarify, do you want the final text, the original 3,459 characters plus the continuation, to be exactly 5,000 characters including spaces? That means I would need to add exactly 1,541 characters. Please confirm, and I will continue, achieving the precise length. Communal feast and friendship are not decorations of life, but a discipline of morality. Shared food trains attention to the other, the readiness to share a limited good, and the ability to acknowledge one's own vulnerability.
Letting someone into the circle of the table is not merely an invitation to pleasure, it is the assignment of responsibility. When people sit side by side and share bread, the rules of honesty and sympathy become practical skills rather than abstract prescriptions. For someone who values the meaning of life in the moment, a meal turns into a laboratory of ethics, where not theoretical kindness, but its everyday endurance is tested. This understanding explains why rituals of eating and drinking point to the structure of human trust. Passing the cup, the gesture of giving up the last piece, these are small acts that accumulate moral memory. They teach tolerance for scarcity, the ability to rejoice in shared good without a promise of future compensation, the skill of listening and acknowledging another's weakness. These habits then transfer into wider life. Someone who has learned to share at the table more easily shares sorrow and responsibility. But not every meal possesses such power. Form matters. Honest conversation and an admission of mortality at the table create a genuine moral impulse, while empty toasts can only mask alienation. There is a limit. The feast is not omnipotent as a moral institution. The eternal assertion that shared food automatically makes people kinder would be an error. A meal can bind together groups of enmity, serve as a means of exclusion, and reinforce moral blind spots. It can nourish idleness and spread hypocrisy if there is no sincerity at the table. Hence the requirement for practice. It must be conscious and open to doubt, otherwise the ritual will become farce. Omar Khayyam in his verses sees precisely this. He views the feast as a chance for truth, and at the same time, a warning about how habits can deceive us.
The image of the table helps to feel the meaning. The circle around which cups roll from hand to hand resembles a small model of the world where each gesture signifies interdependence. The silence between conversations, the sigh after a story, the hand that offers bread. All this is a language truer than declarations of friendship on paper. The taste of food and wine clarifies judgments. The body reports honest data about need and pleasure, and shared enjoyment reduces the tyranny of the ego. This bodily truth matters because it brings the abstract into the practical. What the table teaches can be tried immediately in action. The tie to the thinker is not merely decorative. Omar Khayyam makes the feast not a metaphor for happiness, but a way of living honestly before oneself and others. In his images, the meal is a test of sincerity, a way to let go of claims on eternity and to reassess what duty is. He uses friendship as a field where doubt does not destroy the bond, but cleanses it. The lightness of his irony and the plain-spoken simplicity of the scenes at the table remind us that moral lessons do not always come through abstract categories,
but through a shared cup, through how a person gives the last flatbread to a friend. To cement our thought, the practice of communal meals requires inner discipline. One cannot rely on the magic of gathering. If the table does not establish the habit of listening, if conversation is replaced by verbosity aimed at maintaining an image, then no ethics will grow. But if the rite is combined with the readiness to accept one's own frailty and that of others, if friendship is measured not by words but by deeds at the plate, then the table becomes a school of humanity.
Omar Khayyam reminds us that it is here, between a piece of bread and a raised cup, that the simplest and the hardest ethic is formed, the ability to be present and to share. The practice of communal meals must become an exercise in humility. This is not a theatrical performance where everyone displays propriety, but training in attentiveness to the smallest signs of the other. A guest who refuses a share of honors for the sake of their neighbors teaches everyone that respect is shown in small things. A host who serves himself less than he offers others shows that abundance is a responsibility, not a reward. Such gestures cultivate the ability to carry disagreements and include in the circle those who would otherwise remain on the margins. The political dimension of the feast is also important. In societies where communal eating organizes interaction between different strata, vertical lines of power are weakened. The sharing of bread creates horizontal ties that are hard to fully subordinate to unilateral will. But vigilance is required here as well. When the table serves to strengthen elite bonds, it reinforces exclusion. Therefore, the ethics of the feast are inseparable from principles of justice. Otherwise, the ritual becomes an instrument of privilege. Finally, perhaps the simplest thing, the table teaches us to take joy in togetherness. In a world where much is subject to calculation and absorbed by speed, there is value in slow, contemplative eating. It is an opportunity to slow thought, hear the inner voice and another story, to feel that we are part of a network of interdependence. Omar Khayyam may not offer recipes, but his feast is imbued with a faith that a grain of truth passes through simple human encounters. And if we want to preserve our humanity, let us begin with the simple. Sit down at a common table. The problem is not a lack of knowledge, but the illusion of its completeness. When certainty turns into dogma, thought freezes and speech becomes a weapon. This is not merely an intellectual error, it is a moral danger. Closed-mindedness breeds intolerance and attachment to the power of one's convictions. Omar Khayyam, in his images, often points to the pitiable grandeur of those who proclaim the truth as the only possible one. Such grandeur gives rise to resistance to doubt and consequently accumulates conflict. A micro-consequence of this state is the weakness of dialogue and a tendency to polarization. Instead of a joint search for meaning, an army defending its words grows. What should be considered an indicator of genuine epistemic humility? One can pose the question directly: how to distinguish humility of mind from feigned indifference? The analysis requires 3 criteria. The first, readiness to revise a belief when worthy grounds appear. Not metaphysical uncertainty, but the proportionality of belief to evidence. The second, transparency of epistemic boundaries. The ability to acknowledge that where data are insufficient, different rational paths exist. The third, an active practice of doubt that is accompanied by responsibility for choices.
not an escape from decisions. Summing up, humility in knowing is not the renunciation of judgment, but a discipline of believing only as much as the grounds allow. The sky as an image helps to see the consequences of such discipline. Cups of ideas, one after another, are raised against the moon of doubt, and each either withstands the light or cracks.
This image shows epistemic humility means constant testing of one's cups, not for self-deprecation, but for purity of taste. The point here is that admitting ignorance does not diminish the dignity of thought, but frees it for new combinations and discoveries. The tie to Khayyam's imagery is noticeable. His poetry inclines one to treat thoughts as temporary drinks that should be tasted cautiously and shared honestly. The consequences of such an attitude to knowledge reach far beyond individual intellect. In public life, epistemic humility reduces the temperature of ideological hostility. Where recognition of limits becomes the norm, it is easier to build compromises and distribute responsibility. In science, it turns into a culture of replication and critique. In politics, into institutions that encourage scrutiny and transparency. But there is also a moral aspect. Humility makes honesty with oneself possible. Acknowledging mistakes ceases to be a defeat and becomes a way to preserve trust. Such a shift changes the ethics of discourse. Argument stops being a battle for prestige and becomes an experience of jointly approaching truth. However, epistemic humility has its risks. The question here is how not to slide into paralysis. The analysis shows if every certainty is declared suspicious, collective action slows, responsibility disperses, and decision-making is postponed into endless discussion. Generalization requires balance. Humility must be combined with readiness to make choices on the basis of the best available grounds and to bear the consequences. This means to assert beliefs temporarily and publicly, leaving room for their revision, but not removing the obligation to act when the situation demands. The image of a bridge built from assumptions and tests fixes the boundary of humility. A bridge is needed to cross the river, but no one will stand on its supports without shaking their strength. The meaning of this image is that epistemic humility presupposes the stability. Beliefs must be practical and subject to trial and experience and discourse. The tie to Omar Khayyam's thought in this context sounds natural. His irony and readiness to smirk at great dogmas do not absolve a person from the need to stand up, take the cup, and take a step, even if the ground underfoot is slippery with doubts. The boundary of honest skepticism is clear and practical. Admission of ignorance does not absolve one of responsibility, and an honest mind builds levels of trust and action. The reliability of a judgment is measured not by absolute certainty, but by the transparency of procedures, the degree of readiness for revision, and the willingness to bear consequences. Omar Khayyam offers us not penitence in thought, but the art of living with thoughts, accepting one's limits and acting at the same time, because if doubt becomes a pretext for inaction, it turns into weakness rather than virtue. The end of this line is not the renunciation of assertions, but practice. To clearly state what you believe now, why, and be ready to change your mind tomorrow. The body appears as a mechanism for anchoring meaning. Through skin, taste, pain, and fatigue, abstractions turn into practical obligations. Nerve endings and hormones dictate rhythms of desire. The warmth of a palm makes closeness real. Pain forces a change of course. This apparatus is not merely a source of pleasure or suffering. It is a tester of the truth of ideas.
A moral system that cannot withstand touch will not withstand life. The function of sleep and waking, hunger and satiety, flights of imagination and grounded fatigue, all this holds thought in concreteness, turning reflection into action or into refusal. This is needed so that ideas have consequences. The matter of the body makes moral choices measurable. When caring for a neighbor requires raising a hand, bringing food, laying a sick person down, morality ceases to be rhetoric and becomes a task. Omar Khayyam does not idealize the flesh for carnal pleasures. He draws attention to it as a sphere where truth is tested in reality. Without this mechanism, it is possible to retreat into abstract systems that provide consolation but do not demand responsibility. Why then does the tie to the body sometimes fail? One can ask sharply, which failures turned the body from an anchor into a lure for self-deception? When the body becomes an instrument of ideology rather than a criterion of its adequacy, or when promises of afterlife justice devalue care for the living. Another aspect, technical changes, from anonymous internet to medical interventions, can temporarily blur the direct link between sensation and decision. The analysis reveals several breaking points. First, the aestheticization and exploitation of the body. The market turns the flesh into a commodity, and then sensuality serves not truth but profit. Second, radical renunciation. Theories that promise reward after death can justify neglect of bodily well-being here and now. Third, dissociation through technology. Communicating through a screen sometimes replaces touch, and empathy fades. One micro example. A person who writes declarations of love and compares them by likes does not learn the face to which they would like to reach out. Khayyamian remarks about the fleeting consolation of the cup can cut through such self-deceptions. He reminds us that the taste of reality will not be replaced by virtual praise. Summing up, when the mechanism of the flesh breaks, the simplest thing suffers. The ability to answer for the consequences of one's words. From this grows a distortion of ethics, either justification of cruelty for higher ideas, or a wasteful pursuit of pleasure without regard for other bodies. But the boundaries are obvious. Recognizing the material basis does not annul the need for justice or for critique of social structures. Matter is a foundation, not a license for irresponsible egoism. A visual scene. A palm holding a warm glass of wine next to an ancient book whose pages are covered with verses. The horizon outside the window is charged with dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a step is heard. This image holds two poles, the immediacy of touch and the lure of abstraction that the book offers, and shows how important it is to hold both, not allowing one to absorb the other. The meaning of the scene is that the flesh is not the enemy of thinking, but its examiner. Omar Khayyam often brings poetry and daily bread into the same space. To drink, to talk, to feel the taste of life, and at the same time not lose the ability to question. Wine in the hand is not simply a stimulant of pleasure. It is a means that asks which knowledge will withstand the test of touch, and what kind of care will result in action. The conclusion is clear. Return materiality to the role of examiner, not justifier. The flesh must remain the criterion through which ideas pass, not a factory of excuses for those who wish to avoid responsibility. Omar Khayyam reminds us that honesty before one's own flesh is at once a demand on the heart and on the mind. Living in a body means answering for it, for other bodies, and for the world we touch. This demand is not a dictatorship of the flesh, but a call to honesty. to ask oneself what makes us more human: the weight of a dying hand, the chime of a child's laughter, the fatigue after care, and then to correlate these indications with our ideas. Our task is not to reduce morality to animal impulses, but not to allow abstractions to evade testing by them. Practical morality grows where body and reason meet in dialogue, where the feeling of conscience's unevenness is perceived as a signal to correct, not as an obstacle to theory. In everyday life, this means small decisions, not only to declare care, but to bring food, change a blood-stained bandage, listen without a phone. Not only to speak of justice, but to stand against an offense when a hand is raised against the weaker. Not only to write philosophical treatises, but to pick up litter after oneself. This pragmatism does not limit the dream, it nourishes it. Dreams acquire meaning when they can be touched. Khayyam teaches that the durability of an idea is tested by touch, and in that test, genuine freedom and responsibility are born. Let the body be the criterion. Does the garden not teach us to die every morning and be born again by noon, if only we let it speak? The garden is not simply a collection of plants. It is a textbook written without words, where lessons are given by fragility and seasonality. A rose loses petals not out of malice, but by its nature. This is inevitability, not punishment. In such simple movements, sprouting, blooming, bending under the wind, falling, there is a method that does not encourage drama, but demands attention. Omar Khayyam often sets such mise-en-scènes before the reader, not to theorize about transience, but to see it in a petal, in a scent, in the fleeting light on a leaf. Hence the small requirement to observe honestly, without multiplying meanings where nature has already given an answer. Why does the garden work better than philosophical reasoning when it comes to transience? Because it presents concreteness, timing, cycles, care, and loss. When a person tends a garden, they enter into a dialogue with what does not yield to grand promises, with unpredictable weather, with insects, with the loss of moisture. This is not abstract morality, but a daily test of acceptance and responsibility. Omar Khayyam brings us back to this simplicity. Philosophy found in the soil is less prone to the temptation to claim eternal explanation. Acceptance of transience here is not resignation to fate, but a conscious choice to invest in what is valuable right now, despite the inevitability of loss. The image of the garden does not tolerate metaphorical bacchanalia, a torn alley where all leaves rustle underfoot, a rose that leaves only a thin stem with thorns, a sunrise that at first seems eternal, but an hour later turns into hot dryness. These pictures do not ask for a name. They vividly demonstrate how attachment to forms and moments requires action, to feed the soil, prune, remove withered flowers. In that action, there are no lofty words. There is touch, smell, the fatigue of hands. Khayyam would note, knowledge tested in the garden is not verbose, but it is deep and indisputable. The meaning of these visual perceptions grows into a small but decisive morality, learning to let go without humiliation and to value a rival without the illusion of possessing it forever. The garden teaches that value is not in eternity, but in the fullness of experience. That respect for transience is the ability to allow joy and sorrow a place at the same time. Omar Khayyam, in his verses, inclines us to hold the cup calmly because it may fall. But he does not demean the cup itself. It is worthy of being drunk from. Acceptance of the fleeting is not a renunciation of tenderness, but its conscious form. One must not forget the limits of this teaching.
The garden points to a limit, but does not cancel political and social obligations, does not make loss any less tragic where it is tied to injustice. Acceptance of transience should not become a justification for inaction or submission to abuse. A natural explanation is not always adequate to human morality. Sometimes a rose dies, and it is a tragedy requiring a response, not a philosophical sigh. Nevertheless, the connection with the garden helps to withstand the tension between grief and the need to act, reminding that in the end, the value of the day is measured by what we did in it. The boundary is clear and demanding. To learn from the garden means to let the understanding of transience into life as a stimulus to care and fullness, not as an excuse for passivity. Omar Khayyam returns us to the simplicity of hands, to the smell of soil under the nails, and to the wisdom that a person's honor is shown in their ability to touch what is passing without wishing for its immortality. The garden teaches to accept the end as a formula of meaning for each day. And this is a practical philosophy, convenient for life, but strict about deeds. Does the garden not teach us to die every morning and be born again by noon, if only we let it speak? The garden is not simply a collection of plants. It is a textbook written without words, where lessons are given by fragility and seasonality. A rose loses petals not out of malice, but by its nature. This is inevitability, not punishment. In such simple movements, sprouting, blooming, bending under the wind, falling, there is a method that does not encourage drama, but demands attention. Omar Khayyam often sets such mise-en-scène before the reader, not to theorize about transience, but to see it in a petal, in a scent, in the fleeting light on a leaf. Hence the small requirement, to observe honestly, without multiplying meanings where nature has already given an answer. Why does the garden work better than philosophical reasoning when it comes to transience? Because it presents concreteness, deadlines, cycles, care, and loss. When a person tends a garden, they enter into a dialogue with what does not yield to grand promises, with unpredictable weather, with insects, with the ebbing of moisture. This is not abstract moralizing, but a daily test of acceptance and responsibility. Omar Khayyam brings us back to this simplicity. Philosophy found in the earth is less susceptible to the temptation to claim an eternal explanation. Acceptance of transience here is not submission to fate, but a conscious choice to invest in what is valuable right now, despite the inevitability of loss. The image of the garden does not tolerate metaphorical bacchanalia. A torn avenue where old leaves rustle underfoot. A rose of which only a thin stem with thorns remains. A sunrise that at first seems eternal, and an hour later turns into a hot dryness. These scenes do not ask for a name. They plainly demonstrate how attachment to forms and moments requires steps. To feed the soil, to prune, to remove withered flowers. In this action, there are no high words. There is touch, scent, the tiredness of hands. Khayyam would note, knowledge tested in the garden is not verbose, but it is deep and indisputable. The meaning of these visual insights grows into a small but decisive moral. Learn to let go without humiliation and to value arrival without the illusion of possessing it forever. The garden teaches that value is not in eternity, but in the fullness of experience. That respect for transience is the ability to make room for joy and sorrow at once. Omar Khayyam, in his quatrains, inclines us to hold the cup calmly because it may fall. But he does not demean the cup itself. it is worthy of being drunk from. Acceptance of fleetingness is not a renunciation of tenderness, but its conscious form. One must not forget the limits of this teaching. The garden points to a boundary, but does not cancel political and social duties, does not make loss less tragic where it is tied to injustice. Acceptance of transience must not become a justification for inaction or submissiveness before abuse. A natural explanation is not always adequate for human morality. Sometimes a rose dies, and it is a tragedy that demands an answer, not a philosophical sigh. Nevertheless, connection with the garden helps to bear the tension between grief and the necessity to act, reminding us that ultimately, the value of the day is measured by what we did in it. The boundary is clear and demanding. To learn from the garden means to let into life the understanding of ephemerality as a stimulus for care and fullness, not as an excuse for passivity. Omar Khayyam returns us to the simplicity of the hands, to the smell of earth under the nails, and to the wisdom that a person's honor is shown by the fact that he can touch what is passing without desiring its immortality. The garden teaches to accept the end as a formula of meaning for each day, and this is a practical philosophy, convenient for life but strict toward deeds. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. The garden teaches us care and simplicity. Step by step, we always restore meaning. Renouncing the race for posthumous glory changes the usual ledger of life. Attention stops being allocated to future lines of other people's memories and shifts to what is right at hand: deeds, the body, conversation, taste. As a result, decisions are made differently, not for the sake of a grand finale, but for the fullness of steps that can be felt now. This is not a minor reshuffling of priorities, but a change of scale. The goal is no longer to leave a mark in history, but to fill one's own day with such meaning that it does not need to justify itself before time. A small conclusion: freedom from posthumous reputation brings with it a greater demand for the authenticity of the present. Why, then, is the idea of immortal fame so attractive? And why does its renunciation seem radical? Where does the confidence come from that the memory of others is the measure of life? The question lies at the intersection of society and fear. Societies build reward mechanisms in which a name, a title, and a tombstone turn into a currency of recognition. The individual, in turn, seeks an antidote to his own transience, creates projects, watches reputation, and hopes that an external trace will compensate for the internal fear of oblivion. To this is added a moral narrative that promises immortality through descendants, achievements, books, institutions. Finally, there is an egoistic component. A life built for the sake of others' memory is tense and often disproportionate. A clarifying correction is needed here. Not every struggle for influence is lust for fame. There is a desire to leave something useful, to pass on a craft, to teach. This is not the same as living for an epitaph. Omar Khayyam knew how to distinguish these motivations. In his quatrains, one can faintly hear criticism of those who sell their life for a monument, and at the same time, respect for those who invest labor in manifest, earthly things. The image helps to see the difference without abstractions. Compare a cup from which people drink and a column bearing someone's name at the top. The cup is warm, heavy with water, with scent, with traces of lips. The column is cold and requires time, stone, and others' labor to be erected. The point is not that monuments are useless, but that they are deferred meaning, while the cup is actual. Omar Khayyam writes as if he proposes to put the cup in the foreground. Drink now, talk now, love now. This is not a refusal of responsibility, but a way to live responsibility differently, through concrete investments in people and things that are available. The thought's attachment to the person is obvious. His rubaiyat do not exalt oblivion as an aim. They refuse the theater of posthumous praises in favor of honest use of life. Renouncing the striving for an eternal reputation does not cancel tasks and obligations. It translates the criteria of evaluation, not the scale of the monument, but the density of the day lived. Omar Khayyam again and again offers a simple measure. How much a day was lived with attention, taste, and honesty toward body and spirit.
The limit of this position is also clear. Do not substitute duty, and do not turn humility into a silent excuse for poverty and injustice. To accept transience means to make it the engine of care, not a pretext for apathy. Living for your own fullness today, not for statues and epitaphs. This is the clear boundary of this idea. This is not merely an aesthetic position, but a moral and practical restructuring. When meaning shifts to the body and the moment, responsibility and exactingness toward actions grow. A person freed from the illusion of eternal memory more often asks himself not, "What will they say about me?" but, "What can I do now so that I won't be ashamed in the evening?" In such an arrangement, values become closer to craft, not in the narrow professional sense, but broadly. The skill of caring, listening, cooking, meeting honestly. Craft here is not confinement in technique, but a path of attention. Each action acquires weight because it is seen not by abstract descendants, but by real people nearby. And because the author of life himself feels responsibility for the trace he leaves now. It is also a social choice. If more people direct energy at the quality of close relationships and shared spaces, cities and schools, then society as a whole will become more tolerant of transience and more caring. Such changes do not occur by the command of a single great name, but through routine, often unnoticed practices, through teachers, neighbors, doctors, volunteers. One must not underestimate art either. Books, music, painting help to see and articulate the perishable as simultaneously urgent. But their value is not in guaranteeing the author's immortality. but in their ability to intensify the reader's and listener's attention. They become instruments, not monuments. In practical terms, this changes the image of upbringing. Encouraged are not only achievements that can be displayed in a shop window, but also the ability to be present, to engage in routines, to explain and to endure. Parents and educators inspired by this idea teach children respect for process, not just the finish, but the steps that lead to it. At the same time, it is important not to simplify. Recognizing transience does not mean fatalism. On the contrary, by acknowledging finitude, people more often invest in preserving dignity and fighting unnecessary suffering. Renouncing the race for epitaphs requires courage. One must accept that many efforts will dissolve in history, and yet continue to do what one deems necessary. It is hard, but one can start right today. Yes. One concrete scene. At dawn, a person sets 2 tasks before themselves: to finish work on a stone inscription that will stand for centuries, or to set the table, call the neighbors, and drink wine while the apple tree smells. They choose the table. There is no thoughtless weakness in this choice. Hands are washed, bread is cut, conversation begins. Each gesture is attentive and needed. In his Rubaiyat, Omar Khayyam does not romanticize idleness as escape. He shows pleasure as an act of response to ephemerality, as a way to meet death with open eyes, rather than in the eternal accumulation of merits for posterity's memorials. Such a private case illustrates the ethical thought. Enjoyment becomes justified when it is an honest contribution to the quality of connection with others and with oneself. Microexamples. A neighbor remembers a smile at the table longer than a name on a column. A cup shared with a friend is easier to carry in memory than an entry in an annal. Therefore, pleasure can carry moral weight if it manifests responsibility toward the present life circle. One can ask about rules. What distinguishes a worthy enjoyment from empty pleasure that merely masks fear or a striving for power? To dissect the problem is not an academic exercise, but an attempt to highlight criteria. First criterion: transparency of intention. Enjoyment should not serve as a cover for avoiding duties or for accumulating reputation through public spectacles. Second, proportionality. Pleasure should not outweigh common goods or consume others' resources. Third, the presence of attention. If joy empties consciousness, turning into an automatic escape, it loses moral value. If it deepens the feeling of reciprocity and empathy, it multiplies good. Omar Khayyam brings us back to the idea that wine is not simply a narcotic, but a diagnostic instrument. It exposes the intentionality of actions, shows who seeks consolation and who seeks truth in the bodily and the conversational. The generalization is this: enjoyment is ethically justified when it supports honesty in relationships, raises the quality of life here and now, and does not pretend to replace moral work. The image of an evening where a joke turns into cruelty helps draw the line. Imagine a feast where laughter quickly shifts into contempt, where wine is used to humiliate rather than to ease loneliness. A month later, the same faces will not remember what that laughter was for, but they will remember the harm done. The point is that enjoyment as a moral response hits limits of behavior. It does not neutralize harm,
does not justify neglect and obligations, and does not give the right to use joy as a cover for one's greed for power. The connection to Omar Khayyam's thought is clear. His irony teaches not to turn joy into a mask, and not to interpret pleasure as evidence of wisdom. The constraint of this position is formulated concretely. Enjoyment has ethical force only when linked with honesty, attention, and responsibility. Outside this linkage, it becomes an empty cultural ritual or a means of self-deception. I can continue and precisely bring the text to 5,000 characters, but for that I need to clarify. Is some repetition of phrases permissible, or do you expect a natural, coherent continuation without repetitions? Please confirm so that I produce the continuation to the exact required character count. Everyday ritual has its own grammar, a repeating gesture, a fixed time, essential anchor, and thanks to this, it translates life's contingency into a recognizable sign. The rule is simple. If an action is repeated with intention and shared, it ceases to be merely a task and becomes a carrier of meaning. Omar Khayyam returns several times to the idea that even the most unremarkable movements, a raised cup, a folded cloth, an exchange of words, can bear moral weight if attention and sincerity are present. What makes a ritual authentic rather than empty? The question is not about form, but about the guiding force: intention, degree of attention, and level of collective engagement. Analysis shows 3 levels: personal clarity, why am I doing this? Social transparency, how others perceive it, and bodily repeatability, how the body remembers the action. As a result, meaning arises where gestures bind mind, community, and flesh, and where their repetition remembers finitude. The general conclusion: the meaning of a ritual depends not on its grandeur, but on how much it mobilizes presence. The image can exist without staging. The warmth of palms when passing bread, the sound of a cup against a pitcher, a gaze lingering on another's face. These details carry the coordinates of meaning. They fix the present as a shared territory. For Omar Khayyam, such trifles are not life's ornament, but its support. Their role is to keep us from fleeing into abstraction and to sustain honesty in relations. Rituals easily turn into empty mechanisms when habit replaces choice. The reason is automation. Repetition is done instead of lived. The mechanism of this process is that social expectations and external standards take the place of personal intention. The movement remains, the meaning disappears. The consequences are alienation, the illusion of moral completeness, and inattention to real losses. The boundary here is the possibility to restore intention. Without it, even good rituals become tools of self-justification or power. Omar Khayyam warned against formal play, where outward shine replaces inner truth. How to distinguish a sign that connects from a ritual that divides? The question requires checking 3 markers. Does the action enhance reciprocity, or does it consolidate hierarchy? Does it make presence clearer or serve as a mask? Does it remain under the control of those it concerns? Analysis of these markers shows that a ritual's authenticity is measured by its ability to return attention to living faces and to the transience of time. The summary is this: meaningful rituals are those that strengthen empathy and do not become a public facade. The image of a small daily practice reveals meaning differently. Folding a towel in the morning as a moment of acknowledging one's bodiness.
silently pouring tea as a way to begin a conversation with oneself and with the home. These gestures are like tiny monuments to ephemerality. Omar Khayyam sees in them philosophy, not loud postulates, but repeating simple acts tie us to reality and keep vanity and pretensions of the future in check. Resolving the question of how to sustain meaningful rituals comes down to a rule of practice. Bring clarity of purpose, bodily engagement, and equal participation into repetition. This is a practical recipe. Name the intention aloud or mentally before beginning. Make the action perceptible to the body. Keep the space accessible to others. A brief conclusion. Through conscious simplicity, rituals return meaning to where it had been disappearing. Can boundaries be set for these practices so that a ritual does not become a norm of violence or social coercion? The question opens analysis of institutional risks. When a ritual is entrenched as an obligation, it ceases to be a personal sign and turns into a lever of control. The limitation here is freedom of refusal and the right to change. Without this flexibility, the ritual degenerates. The general idea, meaning requires voluntariness and the possibility to reformulate common practice. The final image. A quiet action repeated for years and suddenly becoming a point of memory. Not a monument, but repetition that creates a legacy of relationships. The link to Omar Khayyam's thoughts is clear. Life is significant in its practice, and small rituals are ways to live with honesty toward one's own body and toward others. The boundary of the topic. The discussion is limited to everyday rituals as bearers of meaning, not to institutional rites or aesthetic objects. Words can seem like ambiguous tools. On the one hand, language fixes order, names and packages the world into concepts. On the other, the same language can tear habitual chains and insert a gap into the conversation where doubt arises. Omar Khayyam recorded this opposition not as a theoretical paradox, but as a practical situation. The word simultaneously creates discipline and offers an evasion. The unspoken rule of his reflections is this: nothing in language is given solely to stabilize reality. Every sign can be reoriented. The conclusion is simple and harsh. Mastery of the word is not the same as its monopoly. Language that merely labels and guards becomes imprisonment. Language that knows how to be ironic remains a guide for thought. Omar Khayyam shows that irony is not only a smile, but a technique for widening the field of attention. What makes a word an instrument of doubt? The question is not abstract. It orients toward the practice of conversation. Irony introduces a horizontal displacement in perception, a distance between literal meaning and implied intention. Through this distance, the transmission of terrifying finality disappears. Analysis shows 3 operational steps. First, the word fixes an expectation, a name, a dogma. Then the ironic device shifts the accent, a fracture of meaning, a play of intonations. And finally, the listener receives a gap for their own interpretation. In this scheme, Omar Khayyam acts as a master of precise displacement. His rubaiyat do not break thought by crude annihilation, but offer to vary meaning. Why is this important, and where are the limits? The reason is clear. Absolutes destroy the capacity for ethical choice. The method's arrangement, in the subtle play of meanings, in the contrast between literality and subtext, gives a chance for a free response. The consequences are encouraging. Doubt makes morality more flexible, allows responsibility to arise not as obedience to norms, but as a personal act of meaning. But the limits are also obvious. Irony easily turns into evasion of responsibility if it serves only self-soothing or cynicism. Omar Khayyam here does not preach eternal relativism. His irony demands taste, that is, the ability to distinguish liberation from the debauchery of thought. The word appears as an image, a sliding line where at the end a turn, and everything that seems solid turns out to be moving. A rubai where one line winks at the next acts like a small physical operation. It crosses out doctrines, puts a question mark instead of a period. This image is not needed for staging. It serves as an indicator, the ability of the word to play at the border of sense and nonsense. When the line turns, the listener is invited to choose, not to sign. The point of this game is that language becomes an exercise in freedom, not in domination. Irony opens space for doubt without declaring war on truth. It leaves room for truth and at the same time frees us from its absolute authority. Omar Khayyam uses such reversals as a tool that teaches listening to oneself and others, without closing off into dogmas or dissolving into arbitrariness.
Fixation. Word and irony are possible as a method of liberation only if tied to responsibility and attention to reality. If ironic displacement becomes a habit of evading questions about consequences, it loses the right to be called liberation. Omar Khayyam reminds us that freedom of speech requires moral sharpness, not less than logical flexibility. Language in this sense is neither savior nor executioner, but a tool that can be directed toward awakening or toward soothing delusion. The choice remains with the speaker and with the listener. The fine line between irony and irresponsibility appears in the relation to action. The word does not cancel the deed, it only redistributes its meaning. It requires the speaker's awareness of consequences and the listener's readiness to hold ambiguity and not substitute it with a hasty judgment. Thus, an ethical maneuverability is formed, the ability to speak with a spark of freedom while remaining attached to the consequences of one's words and actions. In Khayyam's poetry, doubt is not a whim of the mind, but a form of care for the world. It manifests respect for the complexity of being. When the poet questions the obvious, he does not gnaw away at faith. He protects it from complacency and makes it alive. Similarly, in everyday communication, irony can become a caring practice, softening dogmas without destroying them, thereby leaving room for a changeable but genuine response. This is a discipline of attention, to be able to joke about dogmas without humiliating the doubter, and not to use acid wit as a means of displacing empathy. When irony serves as a mask for contempt, when it hides under itself a refusal to engage in dialogue, it reveals its dark side. It becomes an excuse. But Khayyam always includes another caution. The mixture of humor and bitterness must be conscious, otherwise the joke eats away trust. And yet, doubt, when drawn out of cynicism, remains a form of respect for the world and for people. Responsibility makes irony honest. It preserves the bond between people and does not allow the word to become a shield. So, time does not act as a route to a point that must be reached. It flows, and meaning often arises in the movement itself. This is the thesis. Living as if there is one linear goal ahead of you is to reduce life to waiting for its arrival. Omar Khayyam does not teach idleness as a fetish. His poetry insists that the moment carries value in itself, because every heartbeat and every cup of wine is the only point of presence. When thought translates life into the format of a project with a finish in some distant tomorrow, the ability to notice the quality of the present and to adapt choices to its plasticity is lost. Hence the caution. Valuing the flow does not cancel the demands of long-term bonds and responsibility. Recognizing time as a flow does not mean denying planning, but shifting the emphasis to ensure that goals do not devour life for the sake of their own completion. Omar Khayyam shows how the moment can serve as a criterion of meaning, but the limits of this metaphor are obvious. If the flow becomes an excuse for inaction in the face of obligations, it thins into a joke. Either the flow cultivates sensitivity to consequences, or it becomes an escape, and this is exactly the line that must be kept in view. How to live between these poles is an involuntary question.
The analysis shows that it is a matter of allocating attention and of rituals that make the passage of time conscious. Small rites that fix presence, simple acts through which a person feels themselves involved with the flow rather than a hostage of a plan. The master who waters the rose and listens to the drop fall lives the meaning more than the one who waves it off for future fame. In the final result, the meaning is not in renouncing goals, but in the ability to choose when a goal is needed and when a single true breath is enough. The river as an image works on several levels. It carries away the past, it shapes the bank in the present, and it never promises to arrive at a single pre-appointed point. The sense of such an image is liberation from linear rigidity. To live is to be in the flow, not always wanting to cross the river just for a photograph on the other shore. Omar Khayyam appeals to the same images, cup, rose, moment, to show how a flowing experience has autonomous value. His rubai remind us that time is more an element with which a person can enter into contact than an instrument for building an immortal career. The boundary of the approach is clear and short. The flow does not endorse irresponsibility. Presence must be combined with assessment of consequences. The true moment does not annul obligations to others and to oneself. Omar Khayyam proposes a balance, a subtle discipline of enjoyment and attention, where every now counts but does not become an excuse for neglecting what will remain after it. And yet it is important to remember the degree of responsibility. It turns the flow into a home. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty.
This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. This is a practice of presence that requires small rituals and great honesty. In the end, the flow and responsibility intertwine. To live means to be attentive to the present and faithful to those who walk beside you. In this is maturity. This is the great wisdom. Social prescriptions are often constructed as if they know what is best for a person, and they demand obedience in the name of order, honor, reputation, or the good of the clan. The problem is that these prescriptions know how to live their own life. They copy the rhythms of power, consolidate shame and fear, and as a result, genuine joy becomes branded as weakness or indecency. Omar Khayyam does not propose a theatrical rupture with society, but his rubai constantly questioned the very right of norms to dictate a person's inner state. Micro-conclusion. When norms begin to stamp feelings, life loses its palette of tastes, and the person loses the ability to choose what is truly dear to them. How to distinguish imposed formality from the joy that deserves a stable place in life? One can ask this question directly because the criterion of choice is not reducible to one argument. First, honesty of motive. Does a person act from a sincere need or from fear of being misunderstood? Second, the consequence for those close to you. Does the personal pleasure cause harm to those tied to you by real obligations? And finally, sustainability. Can this joy be integrated into relationships so that it does not destroy reciprocity and trust? Omar Khayyam tips the cup towards sincerity and doubt. Doubt not as a whim, but as a criterion of moral clarity. In general, the choice between personal and communal should pass through the prism of honesty, responsibility, and attention to consequences. If norms oppress joy, the consequences follow two paths. The first is internal. Suppressed joy turns into melancholy, routine emptiness, or cynicism. A person begins to pretend. The idleness of the heart is replaced by the mechanics of social rituals. The second is external. A society that punishes sincerity loses creative energy and flexibility. Rituals become dead forms. The image helps to capture this. The rose planted by a high wall. If it is cultivated for the praise of passers-by, the bud is gloomy and dry. If it is cherished for oneself and for those one loves, it gives the scent that fills the home. In these comparisons, Omar Khayyam chooses the idleness that does not destroy others, but returns to the world the smell of living flowers. The consequences are therefore multi-layered. Personal joy is able to heal and inspire, but it can also burn if separated from responsibility. The boundary here should be clear, short, and practical. The personal has priority so long as it does not violate the boundaries of another life and does not turn relationships into commodities without return.
This is not a ban on boldness and not an excuse for the severity of public norms. It is a rule of self-control and honesty. Omar Khayyam does not turn enjoyment into a taboo. He asks to assess its effect on those whose fates are connected with yours. Concretely, do no harm to those who trusted you. Do not break promises for momentary pleasure. Do not exchange long human-to-human relations for short paths of escape. Within this boundary, the person retains the right to joy, society retains the right to stability, and life retains the right to fullness without hypocrisy. Social prescriptions are often constructed as if they know what is best for a person, and they demand obedience in the name of order, honor, reputation, or the good of the clan. The problem is that these prescriptions know how to live their own life. They copy the rhythms of power, consolidate shame and fear, and as a result, genuine joy becomes branded as weakness or indecency. Omar Khayyam does not propose a theatrical rupture with society, but his rubai constantly questioned the very right of norms to dictate a person's inner state. Micro-conclusion. When norms begin to stamp feelings, life loses its palette of tastes, and a person loses the ability to choose what is truly dear to them. How to distinguish imposed formality from the joy that deserves a stable place in life? One can ask this question directly, because the criterion of choice is not reducible to one argument. First, honesty of motive. Does a person act from a sincere need or from fear of being misunderstood? Second, the consequence for those close to you. Does the personal pleasure cause harm to those tied to you by real obligations? And finally, sustainability. Can this joy be integrated into relationships so that it does not destroy reciprocity and trust? Omar Khayyam tips the cup towards sincerity and doubt. Doubt not as a whim, but as a criterion of moral clarity. In general, the choice between personal and communal should pass through the prism of honesty, responsibility, and attention to consequences. If norms oppress joy, the consequences follow two paths. The first is internal. Suppressed joy turns into melancholy, routine emptiness, or cynicism. A person begins to pretend. The idleness of the heart is replaced by the mechanics of social rituals. The second is external. A society that punishes sincerity loses creative energy and flexibility. Rituals become dead forms. The image helps to capture this, the rose planted by a high wall. If it is cultivated for the praise of passers-by, the bud is gloomy and dry. If it is cherished for oneself and for those one loves, it gives the scent that fills the home. In these comparisons, Omar Khayyam chooses the idleness that does not destroy others, but returns to the world the smell of living flowers. The consequences are therefore multi-layered. Personal joy is able to heal and inspire, but it can also burn if separated from responsibility. The boundary here should be clear, short, and practical. The personal has priority so long as it does not violate the boundaries of another life and does not turn relationships into commodities without return. This is not a ban on boldness and not an excuse for the severity of public norms. It is a rule of self-control and honesty. Omar Khayyam does not turn enjoyment into a taboo. He asks to assess its effect on those whose fates are connected with yours. Concretely, do no harm to those who trusted you. Do not break promises for momentary pleasure. Do not exchange long human-to-human relations for short paths of escape. Within this boundary, the person retains the right to joy, society retains the right to stability, and life retains the right to fullness without hypocrisy. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Honest joy heals, but requires respect for others' boundaries and readiness to take responsibility. Thus, wisdom preserves life. Rule: personal joy has primary importance over imposed social claims, not as anarchy, but as a basic reference point of human fullness. This rule does not justify arbitrariness. It asserts that inner fullness and sincere enjoyment set the tone of life more strongly than external prescriptions, which often feed on fear and rigidity. Tension arises where norms claim a monopoly on meaning, Rituals become dropped sanctities, and honor becomes a mask worn to avoid shame. Social claims produce order, but at the same time, they can erase the taste of things. Music sounds on schedule, the meal follows rules, love follows official instructions. In such an atmosphere, joy becomes an object of suspicion and censorship, regarded as a luxury that must be earned or hidden. The resolution is not in a crude undermining of the social framework, but in restoring the priority of the subject through honesty and responsibility. When a person defends their right to a moment of joy, they do not take it away from others, if they at the same time respect their boundaries and keep promises. This simple but demanding position requires the ability to separate the pleasure that nourishes life from the pleasure that destroys it. Subtle control over motives and attention to consequences become instruments of freedom, not its negation. Boundaries here are essential. The freedom to rejoice ends where harm begins, physical, emotional, or institutional. Self-indulgent enjoyment, detached from the context of relationships, quickly turns into exploitation. The personal becomes a commodity, intimacy becomes a spectacle, the meal a symbol of status. Distortions in the opposite direction are also possible. Under the guise of concern for the common good, it is easy to hide fear of change or a desire to dominate. The priority of individual joy must have clear orientations: consent, honesty, readiness to bear consequences. Epistemic modesty plays a double role here. Acknowledging the limits of one's knowledge frees one from the claim to impose universal rules on others. At the same time, it recognizes that not every desire deserves realization without reflection. Doubt does not cancel joy. It cleanses it of self-deception and ideological inflation. The irony characteristic of the Rubai helps to see when high-sounding words are used to conceal cowardice, and when a sermon of modesty serves as a cover for pride. Materiality and the flesh are yet another orientation. The body does not promise eternity, and therefore it demands attention to the present. Bodily desires are not equal to whims. They are indicators of what is useful to consider in the short span of life. Wine as an image remains a metaphor for this carnal truth. Not alcohol as escape, but a state in which masks fall away and simple truths become audible. If society forbids such manifestations, it loses an important way of testing its humanity. Distortions appear also under unequal conditions. When power dictates norms, some groups lose the possibility to rejoice altogether. Here, the priority of individual joy meets the necessity of political and social intervention, not to abolish norms, but to level the conditions of their observance. The right to joy cannot be the privilege of the privileged. It must be accessible. Otherwise, the very assertion of personal value becomes yet another instrument of domination. The semantic link with previous motifs, mortality, garden, Rubai, friendship, and the meal, remains decisive. Awareness of transience gives joy depth. The garden that blooms for the home, not for the crowd, illustrates reasonable privacy of enjoyment. The Rubai are a tool of condensed moral clarity, helping to distinguish fruitful joy from empty forms. Friendship and shared meals remain testing grounds where personal joy meets responsibility, and where honesty of motive is tested for durability. In the final resolution, personal joy occupies the center as a criterion of choice. But this center is not unconditional. It is tied to responsibility, to the obligation not to harm, to the ability to hear others' boundaries, and to the readiness to correct one's own mistakes. This approach preserves space for genuine life, and at the same time
protect society from turning into a museum of idle prescriptions. Brief summary of the thought. Personal joy is more important than imposed rules because it makes life alive and honest. Doubt and irony serve as filters, separating fruitful pleasures from destructive ones. Boundaries, the willingness not to harm and to keep promises, turn joy into an act of moral maturity. The materiality of the body and the finiteness of time give joy weight and urgency. Social distortions require attention to inequality, so that the right to rejoice does not become the privilege of some and the deprivation of others. The whole picture comes together in one demand: to love life here and now in such a way that it does not destroy the lives of others, and that such an attitude requires honesty, humility, and the ability not to be swayed by words.